Hello, my name is Nalani Brown. I'm the philanthropy coordinator at Frank Toby Jones, reading to you at the Point Defiance Reston Senior Center. Starting a new book today, and it is called Mozart Starling by Leanda Lynn Haupt. This was a book that was recommended by a Frank Toby Jones resident. I hope you enjoy it. Prelude, A Plague of Inspiration. This book would have taken me half as long to write if it were not for one fact. Most of it was composed with a starling perched on my shoulder, or at least in the vicinity of my shoulder. Sometimes she was standing on top of my head. Sometimes she was nudging the tips of my fingers as they attempted to tap the computer keys. Sometimes she was defoliating the post-it notes from books where I'd carefully placed them to mark passages essential to the chapter I was working on. She would stand there in a cloud of tiny pink and yellow papers, with an expression on her intelligent face that I could only read as pleased. She pooped on my screen. She pooped in my hair. Sometimes she would watch, with me, the chickadees that came to my window feeder to nibble the sunflower seeds. I left for them. Sometimes she would look me in the eye and say, "Hi, honey," clear as day. "Hi, Carmen," I would whisper back to her. Sometimes, tired of all these things and seemingly unable to come up with a new way to entertain herself or pester me, she would stand close to my neck, tunnel beneath my hair, and nestle down, covering her warm little feet with her soft breast feathers, so close to my ear that I could hear her heartbeat. She would close her eyes and fall into a light bird sleep. It sounds like a sweet scene, but there is a conflict at its center. I'm a nature writer, a bird watcher, and a committed wildlife advocate. So the fact that I have lovingly raised a European starling in my living room is something of a confession. In conversation circles, starlings are easily the most despised birds in all of North America, and with good reason. They are ubiquitous, non-native, invasive species that feast insatiably upon agricultural crops, invade sensitive habitats, outcompetes native birds for food and nest sites, and creates way too much poop. Millions of starlings have spread across the continent since they were introduced from England into New York's Central Park 130 years ago. An adult starling is about 8.5 inches from tip to tail, a fair bit larger than a sparrow, but still smaller than a robin, with iridescent black feathers and a long, sharp-pointed bill. Just over 150 years before the first starlings appeared in Central Park, the Swedish botanist and zoologist Carl Linnaeus had placed the species with its emerging avian taxonomy and christened it with the Latinized name we still use, Sturnus vulgaris. Sturnus for star, referring to the shape of the bird in flight, with its pointed wings, bill, and tail, and vulgaris, not for vulgar, as starling detractors like to assume, but for common. When Linnaeus named the bird, it was simply part of the European landscape and had not spread across the waters. There was no controversy surrounding the species. It was just a pretty bird. Starlings are now one of the most pervasive birds in North America, and there are so many that no one can count them. Estimates run about 200 million. Ecologically, their presence here lies on a scale somewhere between highly unfortunate and utterly disastrous. In the Birdists' Rules of Birding, a National Audubon Society blog by environmental journalist Nicholas Lund, one of the primary rules is actually, it's okay to hate starlings. Sometimes beginning birders in the first flush of bird love believe that it is a requirement of their newfound vocation to be enamored of all feathered creatures. But as we learn more, writes Lund, our relationships with various species become more nuanced. Some species are universally loved. Who wouldn't feel happy in the presence of a cheerful black-capped chickadee? But once we become more informed about starlings, we begin to feel and inner dissonance. Lund tells birders who are first experiencing such confusion not to feel guilty. It's okay to hate certain species, healthy even. I suggest you start with European starlings. In addition to the issues with starlings I've listed, Lund adds, they're loud and annoying, and they're everywhere. Some suggest that the star part of the name refers to the little white spots that shimmer on the tips of the bird's black feathers during the non-breeding season. It is impossible to know the genesis of the name for certain. It's true, among those who know little about North American birds, starlings are not just disliked, they're outright hated. In The Thing with Feathers, The Surprising Lives of Birds and What They Reveal About Being Human, birder and journalist Noah Stryker, famous for seeing more species of birds on Earth in 1 year than anyone ever, writes, if you Google America's most hated bird, all of the top results refer to starlings. Such universal agreement is rare in matters of opinion, but on this everyone seems to concur. Starlings are rats with wings. Birders typically keep lists of the species they see on a field trip, but many don't even include the invasive starling on their tallies. Ornithological writer and blogger Chris Petrak does list them, not because he's glad to spot them, but because he is interested in those rare occasions when I can go almost an entire day without seeing a starling, and those even rarer days when I don't see one at all. The joy of a starlingless list. He goes on to back up Stryker. Bird lover or not, the starling is not a loved bird. In fact, it is without a doubt the most hated bird in America. Common, invasive, aggressive, reviled. Starlings don't just lie beneath our notice. The sentiment runs. They are actually undeserving of our notice. By rights, I know I should agree with the many guests in my home who learn that a starling lives here and pronounce, oh, I am a bird lover, so I hate starlings. I do detest the presence of the species in North America, but this bird on my shoulder, mischievous, clever, disorderly, pestering, sparkling, sleepy, yes, I confess, I couldn't be more fond of her. People always ask how I get the ideas for my books. I think all authors hear this question, and, at least for me, there's only one answer. You can't think up an idea. Instead, an idea flies into your brain, unbidden, careening, and wild, like a bird out of the ether. And though there is a measure of chance, luck, and grace involved, for the most part, ideas don't rise from actual ether. Instead, they spring from the metamorphic opposite, from the rich soil that has been prepared, and without our knowledge, by the whole of our lives. What we do, what we know, what we see, what we dream, what we fear, what we love. For much of my life, I've studied birds. I've watched them, sketched them, scribbled notes about their habits and habitats. I've spent hundreds of hours immersed in ornithological texts and journals. I worked for a time as a raptor rehabilitator, and once I had done that, it seemed that all the injured birds within a 50-mile radius had a way of finding me. People discovered wounded birds in their backyards and brought them to me in small boxes. A flopping, broken-legged gull turned up on my doorstep. One day, while I was out for a walk, a diseased robin fell from a tree and landed on the sidewalk, literally at my feet. And though I left rehab behind long ago, I've too often found myself raising orphan chicks of various species, or binding the wings of injured birds, or making sick birds comfortable as they pass into the next world. So it makes sense that my thoughts, my life, and my work have been inspired by birds, but not by starlings. Because my subjects included everyday nature and urban wildlife, I had written about starlings out of necessity, but not out of true inspiration. Starlings, I felt, deserved no such esteem. As a writer, of course, I live by inspiration. I watch it come and go. When it's missing, I pray for its reappearance. I light a candle and put it in my window, hoping that this little ritual might help inspiration find its way back to me. Like a lover lost in a snowstorm. The world itself is beautiful. Inspire is from the Latin meaning to be breathed upon, to be breathed into. Just as I ponder the migrations of birds, I ponder the migrations of inspiration's light breeze. If it's not with me, where is it? Where's it been? Who has it breathed upon while it was away? And when? And how? Over and over again, I have come to terms with the sad truth that inspiration never visits at my convenience, nor in accordance with my sense of timing, nor at the behest of my will. Most of all, the inspiration wind has no interest whatsoever in what I think I want to write about. One day, a couple of years ago, I was gazing out of my study window and noticed a plague of starlings on the grassy parking strip in front of the house. There are exaltations of larks and murders of crows. A flock of flying starlings is called, beautifully, a murmuration. But there's no official name for a terrestrial flock, as far as I know. Plague seems to be appropriate. I was not looking for an idea that day. I had an engaging project on my desk and was just pondering the next sentence, not the next book. I pounded on the window to scare the starlings away, as I often do when they gather in numbers. The other little neighborhood birds find groups of starlings menacing. When starlings descend, the chickadees in my hawthorn tree rush away, as do the bush tits, even the larger robins. Only the bold crows remain. So I pounded. The starlings flapped and rose half-heartedly, then landed again and returned to their grubbing for worms in the parking strip grass. I rapped on the window harder. And again, they lifted. But this time, they turned toward the light, and I was dazzled by the glistening iridescence of their breasts, so shimmery, ink black, and scattered with pearlescent spots, like snow in sun. Hated birds, lovely birds. In this moment of conflicted beauty, a story I'd heard many times leapt to mind. Mozart kept a pet starling. I can't even remember where I read that in my ornithological studies. It is one of those arcane little details recorded here and there, usually without substantation. I repeated it myself in my first book, Rare Encounters with Ordinary Birds. Later, I was reading Jim Lynch's lovely novel, Border Songs, and discovered that one of his characters mentioned it. When I asked Lynch where he'd heard about Mozart's starling, he told me, "I read it in your book." Oh dear, I began to worry that I'd been spreading an apocryphal story. An apocryphal story. But further research assured me that the tale was true. Mozart discovered the starling in Vienna at a pet shop, where the bird had somehow learned to sing the motif from his newest piano concerto. Enchanted, he bought the bird for a few kreuzer and kept it for 3 years before it died. Just how the starling learned Mozart's motif is a wonderful musico or theological mystery. But there is one thing we know for certain. Mozart loved his starling. Recent examination of his work during and after the period he lived with the bird shows that the starling influenced his music and, I believe, at least one of the opera world's favorite characters. The starling was in turn his companion, distraction, consolation, and muse. When his father, Leopold, died, Wolfgang did not travel to Salzburg for the services. When his starling died 2 months later, Mozart hosted a formal funeral in his garden and composed a whimsical elegy that proclaimed his affinity with the starling's friendly mischievousness and his sorrow over the bird's loss. Mozart is only one of many composers and artists throughout centuries who've had birds as pets. Mozart kept canaries too, at different times in his life. But the fact that Mozart lived with and loved a starling is extraordinary. One of the world's greatest composers chose, as a household companion, what is now one of the world's most hated birds. I have spoken with classical music lovers who are offended at the very notion that Mozart might have been inspired by this invasive species. The bird watchers are just as indigent. What good could be associated with a starling? Along with our understanding that starlings are common and unwelcome arises an assumption that we humans tend to attach to all things common and unwelcome. That they are also dirty, ugly, disease-ridden, and probably dumb, certainly not proper consorts for genius. While I was looking out that day at the pearly snow-breasted starlings, while I was thinking of their despisedness and their loveliness and Mozart in one swirl, I noticed the music pouring from my iPhone Pandora station. It was Mozart's Prague Symphony. Other than being composed by Mozart, this symphony has little to do with the tale of his bird pet. It was written a while they lived together, though I didn't know this at the time. But the synchronicity was enough for me. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I felt a new obsession take root in my psyche. I could not stop wondering over the tangled story of Mozart and his starling, and felt that I was being pulled through an unseen gateway as I began to follow the tale's trail, uncovering all that I could from my 250-year remove. What did Mozart learn from this bird? The juxtaposition of the hated and sublime is fascinating enough. But how did they interact? What was the source of their affinity? And how did the starling come to know Mozart's tune? I dove into research, poring over the academic literature. I took to the streets, making detailed notes on the starlings in my neighborhood. But gaps in my understanding of starling behavior remained and niggled, and within a few weeks, I reluctantly realized that too truly to understand what it meant for Mozart to live with a starling, I would, like the maestro, have to live with a starling of my own. I'd raised several starlings while working as a raptor rehabilitator for the Vermont Institute of Natural Science many years ago. Starlings aren't raptors, of course, but people brought all kinds of birds. It was the official policy of the rehab facility to euthanize any starlings that came through the door rather than lavish scarce resources on them and then release them into the wild to wreak their ecological havoc. Most often, the starlings that came to us were babies, orphaned or cat-caught. The people who brought them had no idea about the ecological conflict and didn't even know what kind of bird they had. They were just filled with compassion for another creature that needed care and had gone out of their way to act on their feelings as best as they could. One little boy, about 8 years old, carefully held out a baby starling cradled in a beautiful nest he'd made of grass and tissue. "Can you help him?" he asked, with wide, expectant eyes as his mother stood watching behind him. "What was I supposed to say?" "Sure, honey, give me the bird. I'll wring his scruffy neck for you." It seemed to me that the lessons to be gleaned in terms of respect for life and compassion for other creatures outweighed any slight ecological impact the release of a few individual starlings might have. So I became a renegade rehabber and made a deal with the folks who brought starlings in. I'd tend the chicks on my own time while they were in the precarious nesting phase, then give them back to their young rescuers for final raising and release. It was fun to have juvenile starlings around the house. They were smart, busy, social, sweet, and made wonderful companions. But that was when I lived in a group house with a bunch of other hippie graduate students, ornithologists. Having wild birds roaming around and a little bird poop here and there seemed perfectly normal. I brought all manner of birds home, from hummingbirds to hawks, and even great horned owls. which my housemates made me keep in the laundry room because they smelled of their last meal, skunk. And I'd always said goodbye to these starlings once they were minimally self-sufficient, not after they'd grown into aggressive adult birds. What would it be like, I thought now, to raise a starling for months, maybe years, in my grown-up household where I had decent furniture, expensive musical instruments, work to accomplish, and guests who would think I was batshit crazy? It turns out that one little bird was capable of turning my household and my brain completely upside down. I thought I was bringing a wild starling into my home as a form of research for this book, but this bird had ideas of her own. Instead of settling dutifully into her role as the subject of my grandiose social scientific musical experiment, Carmen turned the tables. She became the teacher, the guide, and I became the unwitting student, or, more accurately, a pilgrim, a wandering journeyer who had no idea what was to come. Following Mozart's Starling and mine, I was led on a crooked, beautiful, and unexpected path that wound through Vienna and Salzburg, the symphony, the opera, ornithological labs, the depths of music theory, and the field of linguistics. It led me to outer space. It led me deep into the spirit of the natural world and our constant wild animal companions. It led me to the understanding that there is more possibility in our relationships with animals, with all creatures of the earth, not just the traditionally dutiful or endangered or loved, than I had ever imagined. And in this potential for relationship, there lies our deepest source of creativity, of sustenance, of intelligence, and of inspiration. Before all of this, though, I learned that obtaining a starling, as abundant and legally unprotected as they may be, is not as easy as you'd think. Mozart paid a few coins for his bird in a shop. My route to acquiring a starling housemate was a bit more complicated. Chapter 1 is the Starling of Seattle. The details of Carmen's coming to live with me are admittedly a bit sketchy. Part rescue, part theft. A friend turned informant, who prefers to remain anonymous, I'll call him Phil, knew I was on the lookout for an orphan starling chick. He worked for the parks department and let me know that the starling nests under the restroom roof at a park near my home were slated for removal, or sweeping. I was aware of these nests and had been checking up on their occupants' progress. The cheering sounds coming from beneath the eaves told me that the babies had already hatched. When I mentioned this to Phil, he said, "Yeah, well, you know they're just starlings." Park officials do attempt to remove the nests of unprotected pest species before chicks emerge from their eggs, but sometimes the timing doesn't work out, and then the nests are removed anyways. It is illegal under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to disturb or even touch the nests of most birds. But anyone, government official or private citizen, may with impunity destroy the nests and eggs of starlings and kill the nestlings and adult birds any way he or she likes. As non-native invasive species, starlings, along with house sparrows and pigeons, have no legal standing or protection. When federal or state fish and wildlife departments do work that involves the killing of animals, like shooting of overpopulous Canada geese or white-tailed deer, or trapping or shooting of urban coyotes, it is usually accomplished under cover of darkness to prevent protests by well-intentioned animal lovers. Starling nest removal is no different. "It's going down tonight," Phil reported on the starling nest sweep, and I giggled to myself, suddenly feeling like I was part of a bank heist. I thanked Phil and arranged to meet my husband, Tom, at the park after work. I would need his help. While it is legal to pluck a baby starling from its nest, it would likely be misunderstood by any observers, and I didn't want to draw attention. The park was in high use that evening, with 30 little boys running around in soccer cleats as their coach yelled instructions in a lovely Welsh accent. We scooped out the nest that seemed easiest to access and nonchalantly dragged the giant plastic park garbage can into the men's room. Tom climbed on top of it, slipped his long arm between the top of the wall and the eave of the roofline, and stretched toward the churring sound. "Can't reach," he announced, withdrawing his arm, scraped from the effort. We switched places, thinking my smaller arm might slip through the wooden slats more easily, which it did. I stood on my toes, felt over the matted grassy nest stuffs, and stretched as far as I was able. I could actually feel the warmth radiating from the bodies of the nestlings. But while my arm was thinner than Tom's, muscles, he likes to point out, it was also shorter. I couldn't get any closer to the chicks. I gained a deeper appreciation for the starling nesting strategy. They chose cavities that are set back far enough to be out of the reach of the nest-thieving predators, more often a crow or a raccoon than a human. "So I guess that's it," Tom shrugged. "We can't get one." You guessed wrong," I said, glowering. I took a break for reconnaissance and spotted a little soccer boy headed towards the men's room. So I jumped out the door and leaned against the building, trying not to look suspicious. When the coast was clear, I slipped back inside. "Now get back up on that garbage can and get me a bird," I bossed like a wife in a bad sitcom. Tom sighed and dutifully climbed back up on the can as I held it steady with all my strength. I kept picturing the can skidding out from under him and Tom dangling from the smelly bathroom ceiling, broken-armed and clutching a starling chick. We had repositioned the can so the lower roof ledge was smushed right into Tom's armpit. "Hold out your hands," he told me. And into them, he dropped the tiniest, ugliest, most unpromising little creature the earth has ever brought forth. I'd raised dozens of chicks of many different species, from hummingbirds to red-tailed hawks, and of course, several starlings. But until now, I'd never seen a baby bird that was actually wheezing. Like all songbird nestlings, this chick was mostly beak, with a big, fleshy orange gape designed to serve as a target for adult birds. Drop food here. When a chick is stimulated by movement and sound, the gaping response is induced. Wanting to make sure this bird possessed some tiny semblance of health, I tickled the bill and chirped like a starling. The little bundle threw back its head, and the bill popped open 180 degrees. Perfect. This chick was only 5 or 6 days old and would require constant care. A steady temperature of 85 degrees until its feathers grew, and feedings every 20 minutes, dawn to dark. I had hoped to rescue a bird that was a few days older, one that was still young enough to tame but already raised into a bit more size and strength by its real bird parents. I wished I could put this one back to cook a little longer, but the nest was doomed, and with the arousal of my maternal instincts inspired by the gaping experiment, I was already starting to bond with this little sad chick. I couldn't bring myself to return it to the nest to be swept away with its ill-fated siblings. I knew I should get another chick to help keep this one the proper temperature and to increase my chances of ending up with one living. With one living, healthy starling for my research. Baby birds, captive or wild, are unsettlingly ephemeral, subject to respiratory infections and weakened by ecoparasites of the sort I already saw crawling on this chick's bare skin. At this new request, Tom said firmly, "No fucking way." He couldn't and wouldn't attempt to nab any more chicks. I opened my mouth, then widely closed it again. So that was it. This was our starling. I could feel the naked, translucent-skinned belly hot in my palm as the bird slept with its head drooped on my thumb. I tucked the chick carefully into my handy baby bird incubator, my cleavage. All three of us went home. It was at this point that I morphed from Leonda, the innocent citizen removing a non-native bird from a public space, to Leonda, the Starling outlaw. As it turns out, you may torture, maim, or murder a starling, but in Washington state, as in many states, you may not lovingly raise a starling as a pet. One of the ostensible reasons given by wildlife officials I spoke with was the prevention of propagation. There are already too many starlings, and people raising them as pets might eventually release the captive birds, making things worse. Something like this happened in the case of the house finch, a native bird with geographic range that was once limited to the west side of the Rockies. The males have bright red breasts, sing all year, and are easy to keep, which made them marketable pets. In the 1940s, finches were illegally netted along the west coast and transported east, where they were considered exotic and became popular. When there was an official crackdown of the wild bird pet trade, hundreds, perhaps thousands of finches were released in New York by dealers seeking to avoid charges. The birds quickly acclimatized and eventually spread across the east side of the continent. In the case of the starling, though, that rationale doesn't hold up. For one thing, the species has already overrun the country. It would take a huge number of released or escaped starlings to affect a noticeable increase in their population. On the contrary, it is far more likely that the removal of just one chick from the outside world could decrease the future starling population by scores, possibly even hundreds of birds. Starlings are unable to reproduce at 9 months old and often raise 2 broods a year. Say our bird fledged just 3 young its first breeding season. Then those young and all their future young fledged 3 young each year. The numbers scale up quickly. I'm not suggesting that these starlings are a good pet choice for most people, but I do think the current standard makes little sense. In my opinion, if starlings remain legally unprotected, then we ought to be permitted to raise orphan starlings in our living rooms. It took just a few minutes to get our new chick from the park bathroom to its new home. I'd already prepared a mix of crushed dry cat food, hard-boiled egg, applesauce, calcium, and avian vitamins, with just the right balance of fat and protein for a baby starling. This I preferred in tiny bites at the end of a wooden stirring stick pilfered from Starbucks. Baby bird, stirring sticks, my petty theft rap sheet was growing by the hour. Though the bird was a decent eater, it remained sneezy and parasite-ridden. We hesitated to give it a name, not wanting to personalize our relationship and become more attached than necessary to what might be a transitory little life. Besides, we didn't know if it was a male or female, so picking a name would be tricky. Tom sometimes called the chick Little Buddy, but overall, we stuck with it. For its first several weeks with us, the chick had lived on the desk in my writing studio. Its nest was a plastic cottage cheese tub lined with paper towels. I kept a roll handy so I could change them often. The tiny black ectoparasites that jumped off its thin skin were easy to spot against the white paper towels. I picked the nits up with tweezers and squished them. Keeping the makeshift nest clean wasn't difficult. Most songbird nesting poo is encased in shiny, strong fecal sacs that the parent birds remove with their bills and drop over the edge of the nest. So there is not much mess. I just plucked the poo sacs out with my fingers, and like other nestlings with an unconscious evolutionary imperative to keep a clean and disease-free bed, our chick, when it got a bit older, hung its rear over the edge of the nest and let its poo drop outside. Theatrically heaving its tiny bum to the plastic rim, wiggling its still featherless tail back and forth, and letting loose its impressive dropping with seeming satisfaction before falling into one of its deep baby bird slumbers. Eat, poop, sleep. It reminded me of having a newborn human baby, and in some respects, it was even more restricting. The metabolic needs of an unfeathered chick are high and constant. Watching backyard nests, we can observe how frequently the parent birds come and go, bearing wriggly gifts of protein-rich insects and larvae for their young. As the stand-in parent bird, I had to feed my chick several times an hour. When my daughter, Claire, now a teenager, was a baby, I could at least wrap her in a blanket and take her out with me. With this bird, I could barely leave the house. One day, I decided to try packing its nest and food and bringing it along on my errands, planning to feed it as I went. But the chick quickly got too cold away from its heat lamp, so I ended up having to shop for groceries that day with a baby bird nestled, once again, between my breasts for warmth. For the most part, I was stuck at home. If I happened to be away over long, the "feed me" baby starling chirring sounds that poured forth from one tiny chick filled the entire house. At a couple weeks old, the chick started getting more mobile, and though it stayed on my desk, I put its nest inside a 10-gallon glass aquarium. It would jump off the plastic tub and slump around the floor of the aquarium. Its cartilaginous legs, not yet able to hold it up, but still preferred to sleep in its nest. This it accomplished extravagantly, with its head hanging over the rim and breathing with that hot baby bird heaviness. The cottage cheese tub really was getting too small, but the chick seemed attached to it and chose it over the larger Tupperware nests I offered. When the little bird's legs began to ossify and get stronger, I added a low perch to one end of the tank, and it loved to jump on and off the stick and practice balancing there. But right from the start, its favorite place to play, sit, and sleep was on me, tucked in my hands or in my lap or under my shirt. Baby songbirds are not downy like baby pheasants or chickens or shorebirds or any other so-called precocial chicks that are born ready to run about. They are naked at hatching. Horny, sheath-covered pin feathers emerge during the first week and take shape over the course of several weeks. The birds feather out, as the ornithologists say. With its prickly pins, our chick felt a bit like a hedgehog, but soon the little starling's pin feathers unfurled. It became as soft as a bunny and could stay warm more easily. Now it linked to snuggle into the crook of my elbow and, especially, on my neck, under my hair. Our tuxedo cat, Delilah, was only too happy to help oversee the care of the baby bird. She affected a great nonchalance, which fooled no one, and sat on my desk along with the chick, my laptop between me and them. Occasionally, Delilah would lift her paw ever so slowly, and when I glared at her, she'd pretend she was just about to lick her toes and do some face cleaning. I never let Delilah alone with that chick. And because she is good at opening doors, I had to pound a nail into the molding by the doorknob so when I left the room, I could pull a thick rubber band around the knob over the nail to keep her out. Once I forgot, and when I came back to the study, there was Delilah sitting right over the chick, their faces just inches apart. Delilah was purring. Meanwhile, my constant care and parasite picking seemed to be paying off. The bird was flourishing. After 4 weeks, the shape of the iris provided the first indicator of the chick's sex, and we gladly replaced the natural pronoun it with she. The neutral pronoun it with she. We named the starling Carmen, which in Latin means song. That was the end of the first chapter of Mozart's Starling by Leonda Lynn Haupt. It's a pretty good book so far. Thank you for listening. We will pick up on Chapter 2, Mozart and the Musical Thief, next time.